Hey guys, I am here with another zero hedge debate. I am super excited about this one. It is the topic du jour: tariffs. Are they a good thing? Are they a net positive for the United States, or are they a net negative? We've got Spencer Morrison here, and he is an economist. Correct me if I'm wrong, Spencer. I don't want to offend you by
I'm a,
calling you an
I'm
economist.
a, yeah. So I'm a lawyer. I'm a sessional instructor of law, and I'm the author of a book that's just come out called Reshore.
Okay, great. Well, I'll blame Zero Hedge for me thinking you're an economist.
Not an
And then, of
economist.
course, we've got my good buddy Peter Schiff here. He really needs no introduction, but Peter is with Euro Pacific Capital, and Peter is going to be taking the side against tariffs, and Spencer is going to be taking the side for tariffs. So, what we're going to do right off the bat is we're going to have each individual go ahead and state their position, and then we're going to go back and forth with rebuttals. So, Spencer, why don't you go ahead and start?
Thank you very much. For the last 50 years, America and the American people have been sacrificed on the altar of economic globalism. Our industries have been gutted, our technologies stolen and used against us, and our land has been carved up and it's been sold to the highest bidder. And the hardworking American people, they've been raped, abused, and forced to compete for work with slave laborers in foreign lands. And for what? So globalists in Washington and Wall Street can buy cheap Chinese crap and inflate the stock market and the real estate market. They're selling out their American brothers and sisters for 30 pieces of silver. That ended on April 2nd, 2025, Liberation Day, which will be remembered forever as the day that the American people threw off the globalist yoke. When the people rose up as one to put America first and to remind the globalists and the libertarians that America will no longer worship the golden calf of free trade, and that the Constitution does not guarantee you a right to buy spoons and junk from Bangladesh or China. What libertarians don't understand is that President Trump and the tariffs are not just about the economy. The economy is a means to an end. It's not the end itself. Economics and politics, money and power, they're two sides of the same coin. Without economic independence, like the ability to manufacture our own steel, machinery, semiconductors, there can be no political independence. America's founding fathers learned this hard fought lesson in the Revolutionary War, but somewhere along the way, we forgot this wisdom. Since 1974, America has spent $25 trillion on trade deficits. We've been selling our land, and we've been borrowing mountains and mountains of debt to import all of these foreign goods. We've been buying the future that we should have been building. We've offshored industries making everything from the most basic necessities like ball bearings or machine tools to cutting edge technology like computer chips and photolithography machines. America now depends on imports not just to live in luxury, but to keep the lights on, to drive down the street, to put food on the table. This endangers the very survival of the American people. Now, the founding fathers, they knew all of this, and they learned it the hard way. They learned that the greatest threat to the American Revolution was not the redcoats. It was the fact that the 13 colonies could not manufacture enough cloth or firearms or cannons to fight the British. I mean, how can you win a war against someone when you're buying their bullets? It wasn't until the French started supplying the Continental Army that the tide turned, and they supplied over 80,000 firearms, without which the war couldn't have been fought, much less won. After the war, President George Washington wrote the following words: "A free people ought not only to be armed, but disciplined, and their safety and interest requires that they should promote such manufactories as tend to render them independent of others for essential, particularly military supplies." Now, President Washington's first major piece of legislation was the Tariff Act of 1789. That raised taxes on imported manufactured goods and it encouraged domestic production. This was all part of Alexander Hamilton's American System Plan, which he outlined in the Report on Manufactures, which was published a couple of years later. Um, Interestingly, Thomas Jefferson, he initially opposed the tariffs, but after the War of 1812, even he admitted it, and I quote, "Experience has taught me that manufacturers are now as necessary to our independence as to our comfort. Throughout the 19th century, America's leaders continued to use tariffs to build American industry. For example, the Tariff Act of 1816 unified the country's tariff policies, and it doubled the average tariff rate. America had the highest average tariff rates in the world throughout the 1800s. And these relatively high rates, they remained the norm until the 1970s, when those tariff walls came crashing down and the gold window closed. It was tariffs under Alexander Hamilton's American system, which were supported by the bulk of our founding fathers, and every president carved up on Mount Rushmore. These turned the United States from a colonial backwater into an industrial superpower. By the 1870s, America was the second largest industrial power in the world, and by the 1880s, produced a quarter of the world's industrial output. And at the end of the Second World War, America produced half of everything that was manufactured. America lost that top spot to China in 2010. Today, China produces 3 times the industrial output as America at purchasing power parity, and that gap continues to widen. America bought and paid for the rise of China.
Yeah.
Now, 5 decades of economic globalism has brought America to its knees. What Liberation Day stands for, and what President Trump is fighting for, is to put America first, and to free America from the fate that awaits all peoples who embrace globalism, be it Babylon or Rome or London, the confusion of tongues, and the destruction of the nation. Liberation Day is a proclamation. It's a triumph. It's a celebration of the fact that America is not a shopping mall. America is not a hotel. America is not an economy. America is a nation of people, of brothers and sisters, of husbands and wives, fathers and sons, bound together by blood and by tradition, by love of land and language, by honor, and by our faith and our trust in God. I'll leave the floor open to you, Mr. Schiff.
Okay, thanks, Spencer. Peter, what's your position?
Yeah. And while I'm talking, if Spencer can find a way to up his volume, because I have a hard time hearing him. I mean, George, you come in loud and clear, but
Okay.
Spencer's like a whisper. Well, first of all, I do think that we may remember April 2nd, kind of the way we remember Pearl Harbor Day, except we bombed ourselves instead of the Japanese. Look, Spencer, I share your concern over the trade deficits. I've been talking about the trade deficits for over 20 years. I mean, they were a big part of my 2007 book, Crash Proof. So I get what you're saying there. But the trade deficits themselves are not the problem. They're the symptom of the problem, right? And before I get into that, I want to talk a little bit about the history of tariffs, since you talked about it, because tariffs are a tax. They are a consumption tax, an excise tax, like a sales tax, that differ from a direct tax, where in a direct tax, you send the money directly to the government, like when you pay a property tax or you pay the income tax, you send the government a check. But when you pay a tariff or a sales tax, you don't send the government any money, right? You just buy something and the tax gets sent to the government indirectly. And so that's how tariffs work. Tariffs are consumption taxes that are paid by Americans. So when Donald Trump says, I'm taxing China, I'm taxing Mexico or Canada, he's not. He's taxing Americans if they buy Chinese goods, if they buy Canadian goods. It's the Americans that pay the tax. Now, yes, early on in America, we ran on tariffs, but tariffs didn't build America. Free market capitalism built America. Now, the first tariffs came in the Tariff Act of 1789, right when we started the country, because we established the federal government with a taxing power, which it had no taxing power under the Articles of Confederation. So we just, won the Revolutionary War. We had very little infrastructure. The government needed money. And so tariffs were the easiest way to do it, right? They weren't high. They were 5 to 10%. It wasn't about protecting American industry. It was about financing the government, because that was all the revenue it had. And, it was easy to collect tariffs because all the goods came in by ship. And so that you had to unload them at a port. And so you have a revenue officer there. He checks out what's being brought in and he puts the tax right there on the importer, and it's all done. And so that's how the government ran. And by and large, up until 1913, with the exception of like the Civil War and stuff like that, America ran on excise taxes. Not just tariffs, but we had taxes on cigarettes, we had taxes on liquor, firearms. The government collected all kinds of excise taxes. Well, we had a populist movement that kind of overwhelmed the country, in the latter part of the 19th century. And part of that populism was soak the rich, get Carnegie and Rockefeller and Vanderbilt, the robber barons. And the way the public wanted to get the rich was taxing them. Now, the only taxes we had at the time were tariffs and tax like that. The rich didn't care about tariffs because they didn't care if the price of their goods were 5 or 10% higher. They're rich, but the middle class didn't like paying the tariffs. And so, what the government told the public is, "Hey, if you let us amend the Constitution to have the 16th Amendment, we'll tax the rich. We're going to have this income tax that only the billionaires will pay. You'll never have to pay it because you don't earn enough money. And if we could just tax the rich, we can let the middle class off the hook. We'll get rid of the tariffs." Now, the public, even though people didn't go to college back then. I mean, even the billionaires didn't go to college, right? They dropped out of grammar school, but they knew that the public paid the tariffs. They weren't fooled into thinking the Europeans paid our tariffs, and so the Americans were happy to get rid of the tariffs in exchange for an income tax that they were confident they would never pay. Now, of course, the government screwed everybody, camel's nose under the tent. Now, middle class Americans pay income taxes much higher than anybody thought Rockefeller or Vanderbilt or Carnegie would have to pay. We pay the payroll tax, we pay the income tax. Trump talks about the fact that we ran on tariffs, before the income tax. Yeah, because the government was tiny. I mean, it spent less than 5% of GDP total, including the states. So the government didn't need a lot of money, and so it can get it from tariffs. But today we have a gargantuan government made possible by the income tax and the payroll tax. And if they tried to replace the income tax with tariffs, the tariffs would have to be so high that they wouldn't collect any revenue because nobody would buy the products. See, that's the beauty of an indirect tax. That's why the founding fathers liked them and wanted us to run on them, because they're self-correcting for abuse. If you raise the tax too high, you don't generate any revenue. But let me just give you a quick summary of where we are right now, because the president claims that the world is screwing us, they're taking advantage of us, and by selling us all this stuff. He's got it backwards. We're taking advantage of the world. Now, in the long run, there's a big price to pay, although Trump may have just accelerated the long run to this year. But here's what's been going on for the last 20 years, certainly. So we run huge deficits. Government spends a lot more money than it collects in taxes, and doles out the money to the public. The public spends the money, right? But the public didn't produce stuff because this money the government just creates out of thin air. The Federal Reserve prints money. And if we just had to buy what we produce, prices would go way up with all this money chasing those goods. But because we have the reserve currency, the rest of the world is willing to accept our paper in exchange for their stuff. See, normally they wouldn't do that. They would want us to export to cover their export, because the reason you export is to import, right? It's not exporting is a means to an end. You're trying to earn imports. You're trying to benefit from comparative advantage. But we have the advantage of having this reserve currency. So we're able to print dollars and then buy stuff that we didn't make. It cost us nothing to create dollars out of thin air. But the world, let's say China in particular, they need land, labor, capital, all sorts of resources to make all these consumer goods that they ship to us. And we didn't have to invest in the factories. We didn't have to save. We didn't have to deal with the pollution. We just got all the stuff. Now, what did they get? They got the money that we printed. What did they do with it? They bought U.S. stocks. They bought U.S. bonds. Yes, they're building up assets. They're getting richer as we're selling off our cows to buy milk. But in the short run, they inflated our stock market and artificially suppressed our interest rates. So now we think we're richer because our stocks are higher. We get cheaper money because they're buying all our bonds. What we've actually done is we've used the dollar's reserve status to transition our inflation from Main Street to Wall Street. So instead of consumer prices going way up, asset prices went way up. Now, what the tariffs are going to do is immediately reverse that entire process. because by imposing 30, 40, 50% tariffs on Americans for buying prime products, we can't afford these products anymore. I mean, we're broke. We're loaded up with credit card debt. The government is broke. We've already had a big increase in prices thanks to all the money we printed during the pandemic and after the pandemic. So what's going to happen? Prices are going to go way up. Americans are not going to be able to buy stuff. So our trade deficits are going to come down because the goods aren't going to come in anymore. But we can't produce them because we don't have the factories. We don't have the infrastructure. We don't have the supply chains. So prices go way up and retail sales collapse. We're in a massive recession. At the same time, foreigners aren't going to be putting all that money into US bonds precisely when we need them the most, because we've got $26 trillion worth of debt maturing over the next 4 years. We're running $2 to $3 trillion a year deficits that are about to be $4 trillion in this massive recession. And during this recession, there'll be all sorts of bankruptcies. Companies are, going out of business because this whole consumer-based, debt-fueled bubble economy that's been built on the foundation of these cheap imports and foreign credit is about to have the rug pulled out from it.
Okay,
The whole thing's
Peter.
going to collapsing down.
Okay, Peter, just to correct you, 36 trillion in debt, and let's just
No,
give
no,
you
I'm
maybe.
talking about what's maturing. 26 trillion of
Okay,
that
I'm sorry.
36 trillion matures over the
Okay.
next 4 years. We got to roll it over.
Okay, sorry. Let's do maybe 30 seconds more just to keep the timing even. We're gonna go back to Spencer.
Yeah.
Then
So-
could you please just go back and quickly in 30 seconds tell us, you said tariffs are a symptom of a problem, and then you got sidetracked. Can
Yeah.
you just revisit that for next 30
Yeah.
seconds?
The problem is, as a society, we don't save enough, and we don't save enough because interest rates are really low. We spend too much. And because we don't save, we don't finance the capital investment that we need to build factories and things like that. We live beyond our means. And what makes that possible are the trade deficits and the dollar's reserve status. So we have exploited the reserve currency status of the dollar to continuously live beyond our means and go deeper and deeper into debt, whereas any normal country would have been prevented from doing this a long time ago. We've been given all this extra rope, that we're hanging ourselves with. So I agree, this is a big problem. We were going to have a day of reckoning eventually anyway. I'm surprised that we've been able to succeed in kicking down the can down the road for as long as we've had. But Trump has not leveled with the American public about the severity of the pain and what is actually involved and how long this process is going to take before there's light at the end of this tunnel. I'm afraid that there's going to be such a bad economic crisis that the country is not going to, they're not going to stick it out, right? We're especially when he promised a boom and he's going to deliver the biggest bust we've ever seen.
Okay, let's go ahead and hold. I think I said tariffs are a symptom, but your point was the deficits are a symptom of a problem. So, Spencer, I think that to summarize Peter's position there, if you do implement these tariffs in the name of trying to bring manufacturing jobs back to the United States, then this is going to cause a lot of problems. And it's not just looking at the production side, but it's also looking at the consumption side and the people that have to buy these products. And their prices are going to go up so much that the standard of living is going to be going down, even if you bring those jobs back. And it's going to be a very, very messy process. So what is your rebuttal to that?
Well, first issue, are you able to hear me?
I can hear you more now. Yeah. I
All
heard
right,
you before.
perfect.
I was just struggling.
Okay, good. I don't know what was going on with the microphone. We sound tested it before and it seemed fine. So I hope everybody got to hear my statement. All right, wonderful. Well, I'd like to make two brief points of rebuttal before answering your question. To begin with is the question as, the point of tariffs. Now, what Peter has said is that throughout economic history of America, the tariffs were used primarily to raise revenue, and it was not principally to industrialize the nation, and that's simply not true. The quotes that I provided from George Washington and Thomas Jefferson note their feelings on the issue. I mean, they specifically referenced tariffs as being used to develop local manufacturers, and of course, that was the entire purpose of Hamilton's report on manufacturers. But it's not just the founding fathers. I mean, look at Abraham Lincoln. I'll read another quote from Lincoln. He says, "Give us a protective tariff, and you will someday see the greatest nation the sun ever shone over." He was a big believer in tariffs for manufacturing. He said, "I don't know much, but I know this. When we buy the manufactured goods abroad, we get the goods, and the foreigner gets the money. When we buy the manufactured goods at home, we get both the goods and the money. Ulysses S. Grant, he noted in a speech, for centuries, England has relied upon protective tariffs and carried it to extremes, and they've obtained a satisfactory result from it. There's no doubt that this system, it's to this system that they owe their present strength. Theodore Roosevelt, he also supported tariffs, and he specifically referenced industry and manufacturing as a point of the tariffs. So I just want to push back on that. The entire point of tariffs under the American system was to develop America's industry, and it was under the protection of these tariffs that America industrialized and became the world's greatest economic power. Now, moving forward, I want to note that tariffs are the norm. Relatively high, and I say relatively, okay, because the overall rate doesn't matter. What matters is relative to other nations. And if we're looking at tariff rates in the 1800s, of course they're going to be lower than tariff rates now. The reason for that is because there's lots of non-monetary barriers to entry back then. They didn't have large shipping containers. They didn't even have forklifts. So there were a lot of things that prevented the mobility of capital back then that are not present now. So if anything, tariffs ought to be higher today than they were in the 1800s, but we'll deal with that in a moment. What I would really like to address is this issue of tariffs causing inflation. And tariffs are not likely to cause inflation in the short run, and they're certainly not going to cause inflation in the long run. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, the issue here, the question is always compared to what? Okay, compared to what? The goods, we were promised that we get cheap goods. The issue is that when factories have been offshored abroad, the income that Americans have been skewed towards those who have financial capital, as opposed to workers. And as a result, since 1974, what we've seen is an erosion of wages for American workers. What I'm saying is that cheap goods are not so cheap when you can't afford them, and it's always, and the inflation is hidden anyways. Okay, so what happens, and Peter was right to point this out, is that when we purchase goods from a foreign country, obviously we have to pay them something. We're not trading them goods, we're not trading them services. So the question is, what are we paying them? We're paying them in two ways. We're paying them by selling our assets, and we're selling debt. So, for example, last year, America spent $42 billion. We sold $42 billion of residential real estate, like houses. We sold $8 billion worth of farms. We sold $12 billion worth of commercial real estate. And of course, we're selling ownership in American corporations. 17% of American equities are now foreign owned. On top of that, we're selling debt. So the Chinese, the Mexicans, they're lending us money to purchase their products. And of course, not only do we have to repay the principal, we also have to repay the interest on that. So this is a huge issue, because this money is flowing back into the economy, and it's pouring into our real estate, which is raising housing prices. And the question has to be asked: who cares if goods are cheap if you can't afford your rent and you're homeless, right? What we're doing is we're not reducing inflation by engaging in these free trade policies. We're just shifting the inflation in a way that benefits Wall Street and people who own stocks and equities.
Okay, so
Yeah,
let me summarize this point, Peter, then you can go ahead and give your rebuttal. So Spencer, just to make sure that I've got this correct, it's that maybe the cost of the goods coming in might increase, but you would expect to see wages increase even more, and therefore the purchasing power would go up. And then those foreigners, because we're reducing the deficit, wouldn't have the dollars to buy assets. We would hopefully see goods go up slightly, wages go up even more, but then assets come down to where they're more affordable for the average Joe and Jane. Did I summarize it correctly?
Yeah, so I mean, the basic logic is that when tariffs are instituted, that's going to reshore factories, create lots of jobs. That's going to increase wages for workers. So more people have increased purchasing power. And then, of course, it's also going to deflate those assets that are currently being inflated, in particular, the cost of housing.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Peter, what's your rebuttal?
Yeah, well, two things. Well, first, just back to the earlier point on why we had tariffs. I mean, first of all, it was one of the only ways the government could collect revenue. They couldn't constitutionally level any direct taxes. So tariffs were just the easiest way for the government to raise some money. It didn't even need that much money. So the tariffs were pretty low. But, we had no tariffs, between states. All the states were free to trade with one another. They didn't start erecting tariffs. New York didn't have tariffs to protect itself from Connecticut. The framers believed in free trade among the states, and there's no reason not to have free trade among nations, because what made America rich was not our tariffs. Because we were rich, we could afford to pay some tariffs. It was our freedom. We were freer than any country on the planet. And so we built an economy wealthier than any country on the planet. So it was our economic freedom, not our low tariffs, that were responsible for the Industrial Revolution and everything that followed. But getting into the inflationary aspects of tariffs, here's what's going to happen, right? And there's no doubt in my mind this is exactly what is going to happen. The inflation has already been created. The inflation is the expansion of the money supply. So that's happened. Massive inflation, and that's going to continue. Now, a significant part of that inflation has gone into financial assets, stocks and bonds, right? That has kind of insulated the consumer. Yes, if he wants to buy stocks or a house, that's more expensive. And the government has found a way to let him borrow the money, right? Subsidizing debt, guaranteeing debt. We inflate assets and then we subsidize debt so people can overpay for these assets. And yes, I agree that foreigners accumulating our assets is a bad thing. We used to be the world's largest creditor nation. Now we're the world's biggest debtor. And so we have to pay interest abroad, dividends abroad, rents abroad. I mean, we're basically tenants in our own country.
What's the libertarian solution to this then?
No, free. I'll get to it later in this debate, but I'm going to get to the inflation. So here's what's going to happen again with the tariffs. When our money stops leaving the country because we can no longer afford to pay for the imports, that money stays here in America. Those dollars stay here. The goods don't come in anymore that used to be coming in. They're not here, right? So we have all this money and not a lot of goods. So what happens when you have a lot of money chasing a smaller supply of goods? The prices go way up. So it's not just the higher costs associated with paying the tariffs. Even if we don't import the goods and the government doesn't collect any tariff money, see, that's the worst of all, right? The tariffs are so high, the government collects no revenue because no goods come in, right? But now the prices are way up, so we can't buy anything, but we have all this cash and there's nothing to buy, and the prices go through the roof. But at the same time, foreigners aren't going to buy our bonds anymore or our stocks. So stocks come down, bonds go down, interest rates go up, consumer prices go up. We've got the worst of everything. And yes, Wall Street's going to lose a lot of money, but a lot of the banks that loan money to Wall Street, loan money on commercial real estate, they're going to fall. Our entire banking system is insolvent right now, thanks to the government. And when interest rates really go up, they all fail. That's why in the Federal Reserve stress tests, the one thing that they've never tested for is stagflation. They've never run a scenario where we have a recession and interest rates go up, because the Fed assumes that's impossible. So every time they factor in a sharp recession, they assume rates crash. And so the banks survive. But if rates go up instead, none of the banks survive. All the big banks that were too big to fail in 2008 will fail if rates go up.
Okay, Peter, we understand it's definitely a crash type scenario. But to Spencer's point, what would you do to fix these problems? And a lot of the problem, like 90% of the problems, you guys totally agree on. So what would you do to fix them if not for tariffs?
Okay. Well, first of all, we need free trade to help us, because if the only way that we can revive our manufacturing is if our manufacturers have access to the best products at the lowest cost. We don't have no manufacturers. Why do you think so many U.S. companies that manufacture are opposed to these tariffs? Because so much of what goes into our production process is imported right now, right? I mean, like Callaway Golf, right? We make these golf clubs, but we import the grip, the head, and the shaft. So if Callaway Golf Club can't import those components, no more Callaway, right? So what's left of our manufacturing will just be, that'll be the final nail in the coffin. We need less government. not more government. The solution is dismantling the big government state that has been built on top of all this deficit spending and income taxation. So we need massive cuts to government spending, much more than just trying to find the waste, fraud, and abuse with Doge. What Trump should be doing is refusing to increase the debt ceiling. Instead of trying to push through a $5 trillion increase in our debt ceiling, we need to stop raising that ceiling and start cutting government spending and get rid of departments. Don't talk about, like with the Department of Education, Trump says, well, we want to send the money back to the states. What money? The government doesn't have the money. Get rid of the Department of Education. There's no money to send back to anybody. We need to start dismantling all of this government and unleashing free market capitalism. Now, the other thing that we need.
All right. Well, you've said so,
maybe
Peter. You've said that you're in favor of free trade and you want global free trade. The issue is that this is just not reality. This is a pie in the sky idea. The fact of the matter is that America has been getting ripped off by every other nation.
No, we haven't.
Of course we have. Every other country has massive tariffs on American products, and they have massive barriers.
No,
to
they don't.
Our goods.
This is
American goods. Are Americans free to sell cars in China?
Yeah, we don't even make cars with a left-hand drive. Why would they buy in Japan? Are you saying Japan?
Oh, we could manufacture them. They manufacture cars that are made for our markets. There's no free trade because there's no reciprocity. This whole thing is a pie in the sky lie. The reality is that these policies over the last 50 years, these globalist libertarian policies have failed America, and they failed
That's
the
not
American
what's failed
people.
America. It's socialism that's failed America.
Peter,
let's let government.
Peter,
socialism. Look, we can agree that we're not. Look, socialism, sure, that's besides the points of the debate. But socialism is not the issue here. The issue is tariffs. The issue is that America has purchased a net trade deficit of $24 trillion over the last 50 years, and that's $24 trillion that could have been used to build American factories, to build American roads, to build American ports, to hire American workers, and to build our families and our communities. All of that money went abroad. It wasn't paid to American workers in wages, which it should have been. Instead, it was sent to build up China. You look at China since 2001, that country is absolutely unrecognizable. In 1984, the Chinese were driving around in rickshaws, and today they're going to the moon and they're building missions to Mars. And that was all 100% funded by America, by the American.
No, it wasn't.
Okay.
It's because
Spencer,
China was a communist country, and they got rid of communism and embraced free market capitalism, and that's what enriched China.
Okay, guys, I want to stay on point.
$15 trillion of American investment.
Spencer, can you please address Peter's position specifically of the way to bring manufacturing back to the United States is to help the private sector by reducing regulations, bureaucracy, and red tape, as opposed to kind of putting up a protectionist tax?
Look, I'm in favor of reducing taxes, and I'm in favor of reducing red tape. Everybody in the MAGA movement's in favor of that. But I'm gonna push back on this point, because the reality is that American factories are offshoring, not German factories, not Canadian factories, not Italian factories. And you got to wonder why, because American factories are 40% more efficient than factories in the European Union. 40% more efficient, and yet our factories are going to China. And do you know why that is? Because the Germans and the Italians and the Canadians, they protect their industry from offshoring. Americans do not. Our industry, the most efficient industry in the world, the most efficient factories in the world, are being offshored, and they're being replaced by inefficient Chinese factories.
Look.
Okay, so Peter, the bottom line there is free trade is a pipe
dream. It's a
that
sham.
looks good on paper, but it doesn't work in practice.
No.
And therefore, we need to protect these industries in addition to lower regulations in order to make sure that we're self-reliant and that we're doing the best for the American economy.
Look, it's a fiction that our factories are so competitive. If they were, they wouldn't be outsourcing. Look,
it's not a fiction. They are 40% more efficient than German factories, and yet our factories are leaving and the Germans are not.
If they were
the reason is because the Germans,
the
Germans put tariffs in to protect their industry.
Let me make my point. So there's competition, right? And all businesses compete, for the business of a consumer. The consumer shops around for the best deal, right? And so American factories, American companies, in order to give the consumer the best deal, because of a lot of other problems in our economy that I'd love to solve, but they're not going to be solved by the tariffs, because our factories are not efficient. And because if we built the stuff here, it would cost more in order to appease the consumer who's shopping for the lowest price. Companies have no choice but to outsource their production to other countries so that they can produce more efficiently and deliver a product at a lower price. If we really were the most efficient producers, we wouldn't have to do that. We wouldn't have these trade deficits. We would have trade surpluses, which we had in the past when we were the most efficient producers. Even though we used to pay the highest wages in the world, which we don't even do anymore, but we did at one time, we produced the cheapest stuff because we had the most productive workers, because they had the most capital. And why did they have the most capital? Because we saved. We were a nation of savers.
We had the
and we
most
didn't have a
capital
big
because
government
we were
to support.
buying our own
We had
products
free
and
market
reinvesting them.
capitalism. You're saying that the way to build a wealthy economy is to have a big government impose heavy taxes on imports.
No. The way to build a healthy economy, is to allow American companies to compete with one another in a fair and symmetrical way. And that's not the case right now. Do you know why? Because America's economy is open for business to foreign companies that are supported by their governments. These are called market externalities, okay? And you're conflating price and efficiency. American factories are the most efficient factories in the world. They're 40% more efficient
than German factories. What's your definition of efficient?
What's the definition of efficient? It's productivity per hour. American producers can make more product per hour than anyone else in the world.
Of what? Then why aren't we doing it?
Well, we are, but the factories are offshoring because the prices are subject to asymmetrical competition. Have you ever heard of externalities, Peter?
You wouldn't have
you know what an externality is?
Time out. I think where our confusion's coming in here is Peter is including price into the equation for efficiency. So Spencer, would you not include that, or are you including that in your definition of efficiency? I just want to make sure that we're not that we're defining terms here so we're clear.
Well, I defined the term very clearly. Efficiency is productivity per hour. The price includes that, but that's not the only thing that's baked into the price. There's lots of other things that are baked into the price, such as the costs of environmental remediation and the costs of complying with regulations. And these costs are externalized in foreign countries like China. I mean, if the Chinese government were to, prevent factories from polluting and destroying the earth and dumping plastic into the oceans, then the cost of Chinese goods would actually be more than the cost of American products. And the reality is that price is not everything. We're not just an economy, we're also a nation, and this nation has to uphold its own laws, whether those are labor laws, environmental laws. I mean, offshoring is allowing American companies to break the law and destroy the environment and to destroy our own people for marginal profits.
Okay, so Peter, you understand just for the audience there, the argument is they're destroying the environment, they're using child labor, they're basically cheating, like the Trump administration would say, and therefore it's not a level playing field, Peter. So even if we did have free trade, even if we reduced our regulations, we're still not going to implement child labor. So therefore, we're still going to be at a disadvantage. They're going to be able to bring in things cheaper, and that doesn't solve any of the problems. And therefore, we need we need a tariff in order to level the playing field. And then the American consumer will likely buy American goods because they're produced more efficiently.
Well, first of all, we have trade deficits with just about every country on the planet, right? So it's not just China. And so you can't blame all of our trade deficits on lack of environmental laws or lack of child labor laws, because we have trade deficits with all sorts of advanced economies that have all kinds of laws like that, the same that we do. But look, let's assume that there is a country that is producing stuff and creating a lot of pollution for its own people, right? Not for us, but they're polluting their environment halfway around the world. And as a result, they're producing something cheaper than what we can. Well, then that's just a gift to us. we got to get that cheaper so we could focus on something else. You know, the
We
more
share the atmosphere, Peter.
no, oh, come on. So,
We're breathing the Chinese air that they're polluting.
yeah,
We're
all right.
drinking
Well,
their acid rain from our rivers. Look, we shouldn't be outsourcing our pollution because it comes back to us in the same way that the inflation comes back to us.
Look,
This
basically what you're
is
saying,
crazy.
if
There are values other than money.
What you're saying is, if some products just, you know, washed up on our shores for free, we should throw them away because we didn't have to produce them. We should look a gift horse in the mouth. If you know,
we are paying for them. We're selling our inheritance and we're borrowing against our future. We're selling assets and debts to get them. There's no free lunch here, Peter.
Look, whatever money we save, if we get something cheaper from abroad, then we could take the savings and invest it in something else. Look, the whole idea behind an economy is to produce as many consumer goods as possible to satisfy the demands of your people, right? Because the limiting factor is production. That's what's scarce. That's why when Donald Trump says that we've got all the cards because we're the consumer, China has the cards. They're the producer. That it's supply that creates demand. Demand doesn't create supply. The hard part is to produce stuff. And so if we can get some stuff for less money, then that's great. Now we can focus our resources on other stuff because there's an unlimited amount of stuff that people want. And the way to deliver the highest standard of living is the most amount of economic freedom. When we're free to trade with one another, when people of one state are free to trade with people in another state, and people of one country can trade with people in another country. Remember, America doesn't trade with China. I'm an American. I trade with a private citizen who happens to live in China. We're two people doing business with one another, voluntary to our mutual advantage. See, what you're doing is you're looking at the trade deficit as the problem. The trade deficit is the symptom of the problem. And
no, I'm simply recognizing that nations exist.
We did this to
there
ourselves.
Are different levels of hierarchical organization in society over and above the individual. An individual exists, but in an ontological sense, so does a family or a nation or a people. Right? You just don't understand what America is. You're saying America's a market. America's not a market. America is a people.
I want to say focus here, Spencer. I think what Peter is getting at is comparative advantage. So what's your view on comparative advantage? And is there an argument that if we can't produce rubber and Malaysia is producing rubber, then we can go ahead and import it to make those tires here, even though that might result in a trade deficit?
Well, I'm going to talk about comparative advantage, but I'm just going to finish my point. The purpose of the economy is not to maximize production. The purpose of the economy is to serve the best interests of the nation and the people. And those interests transcend simply consuming products. The interests are to serve, to create beauty and to promote and protect the environment, to preserve a future for the people, not to maximize the current generation's benefits at the expense of our progeny. But to
Spencer,
deal with
who chooses what the best interest is for the United States public? Who gets to choose
the people, and that's why we elected. That's why Donald Trump got elected to do this. If the that's the whole point of it.
Oh, it's a good answer.
And then speaking with comparative advantage. You know, comparative advantage is a theory that was invented by this guy named David Ricardo. He died in 1823, and he wrote about the comparative advantage in his book.
It's a fact.
It's not a fact. And you know what? The funny thing is that in the Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, which he wrote, David Ricardo said that this was a domain-specific theory. That is, this theory only applies when certain criteria are met. And do you know what two of the limiting factors are? Libertarians never bring this up. But two of the limiting factors are that the assumption is, one, capital is immobile, because this was written in the early 1800s when capital was immobile. That is, David Ricardo said, assume that this theory works if it's impossible to move a factory from England to Portugal. But capital is immobile. It's mobile today. You can take a factory from England or from America and you can move it to Portugal and China. So the entire theory of comparative advantage falls apart because one of the fundamental assumptions is incorrect. And then David Ricardo, he also said, and this is he specifically writes that this theory is predicated upon people having a preference for their own products from their own country because they're patriotic. And that's obviously not true.
Look, but
Okay, so
obviously,
Peter, what's your rebuttal there for comparative advantage?
well, look, I mean, of course, that's the whole nature of society. That's specialization. I mean, we all do that. Look, I don't grow my own food. I buy it from a farmer because I don't want to grow fruit in my backyard. He's got a comparative advantage to me. He's already got a big farm. I don't want to be self-sufficient in everything. I'm gonna figure out what I do best, and that's what we all do. We have a job. We do what we do best, and then we trade. No one is a jack of all trades. I don't make my own clothes. I don't farm my own food. I didn't build my own house. I traded with other people, and I'm better off as a result of that. But
Yeah, but we're not trading any production. We're trading assets and debts, which destroys the entire theory.
Look, I think we have government to protect the rights of the individual. I think government is there to protect our rights. That's why it was established. I believe we're a republic because we have a constitution to protect us from the whims of the majority. And we don't live in a country where we elect a leader who now has to run the whole economy, which is, what the Commerce Secretary said, Ludnick, the other day. He said, let Donald Trump run the global economy. He knows what he's doing. It's not the job of the government, the president, to run our economy, let alone the global economy. His job is to protect my rights, secure my liberties that are given to me by the Constitution and by God, not by the government. And so, yes, and people should be able to pursue their own happiness any way they want. And in many cases, that is having more consumer goods. People want to.
But let's go back. Let's go back to this critique of comparative advantage. David Ricardo writes in his book. He writes specifically, and I quote, "It would undoubtedly be advantageous to the capitalists and consumers of England that the wine and cloth should both be made in Portugal, and that the capital and labor of England employed in making both cloth and wine should be removed to Portugal for that purpose." David Ricardo says that if you can move the factories to Portugal, then there's no sense in having any economy in England. And you'll remember the example in David Ricardo's work is that England is more productive at making wine and cloth than Portugal, right?
No. I think France was wine and England was textiles.
Yeah, but in the example, the comparative that's competitive. That comparative advantage is when one country is better at making both things, but they're comparatively better at making something else. And what David Ricardo says is that you should focus on what you're best at making and then offshore and then import the thing you're less good at making. However, that theory only works if you're trading goods for goods, which we're not, because we're actually trading assets and debt, which means a large portion of our economy is idle. People aren't working because we're not making goods. So and then number two, if you can move the factory to Portugal, David Ricardo specifically says move it to Portugal, and the theory breaks down, because if you move all the factories to Portugal, you have no economy. And if you're not making any product, then you're just selling assets.
Spencer,
you don't have any economy.
All right. Let me ask you a question. So how do you explain countries that have lower tariffs than we do? I mean, we're not tariff free, right? We have tariffs on certain things and a lot of agricultural products, on pickup trucks, but there are countries that have lower overall tariffs than we do, yet they have trade surpluses. They don't have the problem. So if you're saying that any country that practices freer trade is going to get taken advantage of and exploited and decimated, how come like a Switzerland or a Singapore, a lot of these countries that have very low tariffs or zero tariffs, how come they do fine? How come they don't have the same problem that we have? And they face the same tariffs that we do, selling into China or selling into other countries that you claim are cheating. They manage to have surpluses or balanced trade with all those countries that we have huge deficits with.
All right. Well, first of all, you didn't actually answer my question. You just asked me a completely unrelated question.
I didn't know you asked me one.
But I can answer your question.
We can circle back to that.
America is an industrialized economy. Singapore is a tiny city. They're not at all comparable.
So that's how you describe Singapore, a tiny
Singapore
city.
is not at all remotely comparable to America as an economic entity. And
yeah, they're doing a lot better.
Well, are they doing better than you're comparing Singapore to America, or are they doing better than New York City or San Jose?
But this is subjective, guys. So let's
these
stay
are
off
silly
that.
things to compare. I mean, look, we're dealing with an industrial economy, not a city state.
Well, it's all industry in Singapore. What do you think? What do you think they got over there?
Okay, so Spencer, your position there is it's apples to oranges. So you can't just say that because some small city state has
Well,
a
there are
trade
big
surplus, we
countries
don't have
too.
tariffs. Okay, so do you want to?
What's the
I
big
think we
country?
should get back to the or excuse me, I might be using that term incorrectly, Spencer. But the competitive advantage, where you can, where it was wine in France and textiles in England, and both countries benefited because the English tried to make their own wine, that didn't pan out, and the French tried to make their own textiles, that didn't pan out. So they figured it'd be better just to trade with one another.
Sorry, is that a question for me?
Yeah, I was just wanting you to address that if you would.
Okay, like I said, David Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage is domain specific and it relies on certain assumptions. David Ricardo has some explicit assumptions and he has some implicit assumptions. The assumptions that matter for our purposes are that the theory is based on the nations trading good for goods, right? So England is, and it's England and it's Portugal. So England is trading products to Portugal. Portugal is trading products back to England, right?
Yeah. So
If you
I would
add
just
in,
say
if
the
you add it,
comparative advantage,
if you add
comparative
into the
advantage,
mix the
Peter,
ability to
Peter, let's
sell
just let him
assets,
finish, and you can go.
look, if you add in the ability to sell assets and debts, what you're doing is you brought in an exogenous entity into this model, right? Because the reality is that you can sell, if you have a lot of assets, which are accumulated production in the past, and if you have a lot of debt that people are willing to buy, which is the promise to pay in the future, you could literally shut down your economy and produce nothing for years and still bring in products. But that simply shuts down the economy. And that's what we're doing. When America offshores its production to China and then pays for it by selling our heritage and mortgaging our future, we're shutting down $1 trillion worth of GDP every year to import it into the country. And you can say, oh, that's our benefits from trade. But it's not, because you have 5 million people who are out of work and who are bidding down prices on the labor market. And then on top of that, because we're offshoring factories to these third world countries, you got to race to the bottom. You're putting American workers in direct competition with people in Nigeria or India or China. And how the hell are they supposed to compete on price with those people? It doesn't make any sense at all.
Okay, Peter, so go ahead and address that specifically, please. How can an American worker compete with someone in Cambodia that's willing to work for $1 an hour?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, first of all, I'll get to that in a sec. But comparative advantage is a fact. It's something that Ricardo observed and he came up with a name. Like Isaac Newton, observed gravity and gave it a name, right? But gravity is a fact, and so is comparative advantage.
Okay, but he said it's domain
theory.
specific. It only works when certain preconditions are met.
It
Do you
is
deny
a
that?
fact. It is an
Do you deny that
economic
it's domain
fact.
specific?
Look, you can deny it all you want, but it's a
It's
fact. But
domain
anyway,
specific. David Ricardo specifically
But-
said it's domain specific. Do you
Spencer,
deny
I
that?
think,
Do you want me to
Spencer,
read
I
you the
think
text
Peter's
again?
position is it doesn't matter what Ricardo said. This is his worldview. So I don't want to quibble over what David Ricardo said.
But in any event, back in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, right? Before we really started building up the welfare state under Johnson in the 1960s, America had the highest wages in the world. No country even came close to what we paid. Yet we produced the lowest cost merchandise and we exported our surpluses all over the world. Everything was made in America. Everything that we now import was built here with American factories and American labor, and not because of tariffs, because we had more economic freedom than anybody else. And because we were so free, we were so much more productive than everybody else. So we were able to outcompete low labor because we had more capital. Our workers had more capital than their workers, and so they were more productive. We lost that advantage over the decades, because of all the government and all the regulations. We were slowing down, and other countries like China threw away communism and embraced capitalism. And so they were going in the other direction. As we were getting more socialistic, they were getting more capitalistic. And so the pendulum swaying in the other direction. But a question I just want to throw out there, which I think is something we really should be discussing. All right, let's say, Spencer, yeah, you want us to start making all this stuff that we're now importing, all these goods, and there's so many categories of goods that 80, 90, 95% of it we import, right? You want to start making all this stuff. How the hell are we going to do it, right? We don't have any of the factories that exist right now. Yeah, we have a lot of malls, we have a lot of shopping centers, right? But we don't have the factories. And it's not just the factory. There's all this the supplies, the supply chains. There's so many different companies that integrate with one another in order to supply a factory. We don't have any of that. We don't have the workers that know how to do any of that. So how the hell are we going to start like this year? All of a sudden, how are we going to be able to replace all the stuff, right? $1 trillion worth of stuff that's now coming in, and actually more, because we're going to get rid of almost all of our imports, not just the trade deficit.
Yeah.
So how are we going to how are we going to just create all this stuff?
Okay, so I think Spencer's got the question. Spencer, do you want to address that, and then maybe also address how we were so successful and productive in the 1950s without the current level of tariffs that Trump has instituted?
Yeah, I mean, very briefly, the reason that we were doing so well in the 1950s through 1970s is because there was no competition. Europe and Japan were the only industrial powers at the time, and both Japan was 96% firebombed. They produced nothing, and Europe was completely decimated after World War II. And the only other industrial power was the Soviet Union, and they weren't in the global markets. America had a monopoly.
Did well
on these
before
products.
the war too.
But
America had a monopoly on these products. Right. So, I mean, that's why America did so well. And the fact that tariffs were relatively low didn't matter because nobody else had any ability to.
But they had cheap labor.
Well, they didn't have capital. Like you said, capital accumulation is important. And I think it's interesting that you recognize the fact that capital accumulation is important. And yet your policies have resulted in the massive capital outflows from the states.
No, those aren't my policies.
China.
No. Just because
you're in favor of the current trade paradigm.
No.
Right?
Yeah, I'm in favor of free trade.
Yeah, you're in favor of free trade, but guess what free trade does? Free trade takes productive American assets. Free trade is, of course, the problem.
The problem is the Federal Reserve with artificially low interest rates. The problem is oppressive regulations.
It doesn't matter because this is all from the government. This is all verified academic
free trade.
Nonsense. The fact of the matter is that American free enterprise is never going to outcompete state-backed Chinese companies or Japanese Keiretsus or German companies that are backed by. You talk about socialism. Germany is much more socialistic than America, and yet their productions they're not offshoring their factories. They still have all their industry. Yeah. So I don't think it has anything to do with that. It's because Germany has big tariffs.
Spencer,
you're making a logical fallacy. You're picking out one aspect of our economy, free trade, and you're blaming all of our problems on that. You're ignoring all of the other things that have caused our problems. And without free trade, the problems would be even worse. Right?
No, I'm saying that it's an 80-20 Pareto distribution.
We have so many bad things that you should be focused on, not freedom to trade. That is not a bad thing. Human beings having more freedom is always good, right?
We don't have more freedom. American companies are competing with the Chinese government.
That
That's
artificially
not
manipulates interest rates to discourage us from saving, that inflates financial bubbles, to have governments running these massive deficits that are sucking the capital out of the economy and crowding it out and leaving us no choice but to import. The government is doing it to us, not China, not Mexico, not Canada, not Europe. Washington, D.C. is doing it to us. We're our own worst enemy. We have to acknowledge that, right? It's very easy to scapegoat somebody else and cry that we're a victim, right?
It's not about scapegoat. It's not about scapegoating. The economic history.
Peter, go ahead. I think Spencer understands your position. Spencer, what's your rebuttal?
Yeah, it has nothing to do with scapegoating. I think the economic history makes it very clear that China, and I'm not blaming the Chinese. The Chinese are doing what's best for China. They have a China first trade policy, and their trade policies are specifically designed to prey upon America's markets. That's why they have an export-oriented economy. That's why they give them preferential land use. That's why they have massive barriers to entry for American products. The Chinese want to have a large trade surplus because they want to accumulate capital and they want to have a lot of manufacturing jobs in industry because they know that manufacturing and the ability to produce ships, automobiles, computers doesn't just produce long-run economic wealth. it also makes them geopolitically powerful because they're the ones who are producing everything. And I don't
they don't need us
understand
for that.
why we don't how do you not understand this? If America doesn't produce anything, America is a paper eagle.
Okay,
Yes,
so Peter,
that's my point.
So Peter, let's focus on that here, because I think Spencer's position here is we need to be more self-reliant. Right. As an example, during COVID, we had all our pharmaceuticals coming in from China, and this puts us at a massive disadvantage. And so, how do you address that if not for tariffs? Sure, we can have this free market capitalism that only exists in a dream or in a Milton Friedman textbook. But in reality, we've got to reduce regulations. We've got to reduce the red tape. We've got to reduce the taxes. And we need to protect our industries, because that's the only way that we can guarantee that we're going to be self-reliant in the future.
No, capitalism protects our industries. The least amount of government is the only protection that our businesses need. We need to be freer than other countries. And we do need to incentivize savings in this country. We have to allow interest rates to go up, which is where they should be. See, if we had much higher interest rates, we wouldn't have this problem. But the Federal Reserve artificially suppresses interest rates to prevent Americans from saving. So we keep on spending to keep the bubble going. That is the problem. The consequence, the symptom, are these massive chronic trade deficits that would never exist in a free market. A country that ran deficits like ours would have had a currency crisis a long time ago. Their currency would have crashed, and that would have put an end to the imports. But we have been able to do this because China has been, playing by the global rules of, the dollar's the reserve currency. We want to go earn dollars. Well, how do we earn dollars? We sell stuff to America because they've got all the dollars, right? That's the reserve currency. But you know what? China would be much better off if they just let the dollar crash, because they've spent a lot of time accumulating dollars and treasuries and, trying to keep the dollar high so they can keep selling us stuff that we can't really afford. The best thing that China can do for its own economy is to sell every treasury that they own, dump their dollars, buy more gold, whatever gold they can get their hands on, and then back the RMB, the yuan, peg it to gold, let their currency go way up. They don't need a weaker currency. They need a stronger currency. Then 1 billion Chinese, they're going to see the real value of their wages skyrocket. And now there's all these consumers in China who got so much purchasing power, they can buy every product that the Chinese are now sending to America. And they can enjoy the fruits of their labor instead of allowing America to enjoy the fruits without doing the labor. And so they get to keep all their stuff, and we get to keep all our inflation. We get money and they get stuff. I mean, the whole idea that, we're special because we buy stuff. Anybody can buy stuff, right? The Chinese are perfectly able to go to a store and load up a shopping cart with stuff and take it home. They don't need us to do that. We need them to produce the stuff to put in the shopping cart, because without them producing it, we got nothing.
Okay, Spencer,
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, look, it's not just big government. I think we're all on the same side when it comes to big government. We want smaller government. We want less taxes.
Well, tariffs are bigger government.
Tariffs are not bigger. It's not bigger government. We're keeping big government
Peter.
out of American markets. The Chinese government is the biggest government in the world, and every Chinese industry that's exporting their crap to America is an arm of the Chinese government. They're directly subsidized by the Chinese government. They get loans. They dump their products in American market at below market prices.
Well, there are a lot of countries that have trade surpluses with China. Why is that? There are plenty of
because
countries
they're selling
that
them
have
raw
surplus with China.
materials.
Huh?
They're mercantile resource colonies. Do you want America to be a
There's always an
mercantile
excuse,
resource colony?
right? There's always an excuse.
Peter, let's
It's
let him
not an
finish.
excuse. It's a fact. It's an economic fact. And I've raised this issue 3 times with you, and you don't have a response. And I'd like to raise
What
it
issue?
again. And I'd like to hear your response.
What's
Well,
the
the
issue?
fact is that Germany has a bigger government than America, and yet German industry is not offshoring. China has a bigger government than America, and their industry is not offshoring. Where our stuff is going there. So how do you grapple with that fact?
Well, first of all, define bigger, because we got the biggest government in the world. We spend $7 trillion a year. Nobody comes close to that. So in sheer size,
it's per
we're running
capita.
the biggest government on
I
the
think
planet.
America's
to be fair, I
government
think
is
he's
way
talking
smaller
about
than
the
Germany's
percentage
per
of government
capita.
spending to GDP.
Yeah, well, what are we at? About 40% with state and federal government?
Well,
Probably a little higher than
I
that.
just wonder how you square this circle where you're saying that, oh, America's industry is offshoring because we have big government. And then you got Germany and Italy, and they have bigger governments in America, France, and their industries
look.
are not offshoring. And then China's
Yes.
got the biggest government of them all, and they're actually gobbling up our industry. So
Yeah,
I don't
but
think
there
it
are
has anything
governments.
to, it has nothing to do with big
Yeah,
government, and
there,
it has everything
there.
to do with insane self-destructive trade
Yeah,
policies
there.
that are instituted by
All right, let me
Okay,
globalists
answer your
to
Spencer, I
question.
line
think
their
I think
pockets.
First of all, so
okay, go
first of
ahead,
all,
Peter.
there are other countries that have much smaller governments than we do that have trade surpluses. So it's not, it's not the size of the government, but the difference is we have the reserve currency. They don't. And so we have had this privilege that we didn't have to do a lot of stuff that other countries had to do. Yet we didn't have to export to import. We could print. We could cheat. We could take the easy way out. We could just make money out of thin air and buy all kinds of stuff. And so we relied on that as a crutch. And because we've been able to do that, we've allowed our economy to disintegrate beneath our feet. That's the trade-off that we've made. We've indulged ourselves at the expense of our future. We've been able to live beyond our means, right? So politicians can keep telling us how great everything is, and they keep measuring our GDP by how much money we spend, and they ignore how much money we borrow. They ignore the transfer of our wealth from domestic hands to foreign hands, and they keep the whole thing going, right, with the reserve status of the dollar and the artificially low interest rates. And so that is the difference. We're the only country that prints the reserve currency. And so we're the only country that can get away with this.
Okay, so Peter, is your position that has made the United States, let's say manufacturing producers as a whole, lazy, and therefore that laziness is why the Germans with a bigger government can outcompete us?
It's not laziness. It's just market forces in that if our dollar is artificially high, higher than it should be, then we could get things cheaper from abroad because our dollars go a lot farther when we
Okay.
spend them abroad. If the dollar was allowed to crash, and it would crash if it wasn't the reserve currency, our trade deficits would go away. We couldn't afford to import anymore. Now we would have all the cheap labor, right? Because the dollar would crash. People would start, maybe trying to build factories here to hire all these poor Americans. But we have this artificially high currency that does not bear any resemblance to our actual purchasing power. It's because the rest of the world is warehousing our money,
Okay.
because they think it's gold. I mean, at one point, when the dollar was the reserve currency and it was backed by gold, it was a different story because the dollar was gold. It was something real. But now it's nothing. It's just a piece of paper. We can print as many as we want. But we have been living off of that exorbitant privilege to our own long-term detriment. My point is Donald Trump is accelerating the day of reckoning so that we might have it this year. I mean, we could have a complete economic implosion, which we were going to have eventually anyway, but we just have it right now. But the problem is, and what I'm worried about, is Donald Trump has no idea the can of worms he just opened up. He actually thinks that it's just going to be an immediate boom. He has no idea the gravity of the bust that we're going to have to experience and how the Democrats, he has now taken that party and completely resurrected it. They had nothing. They were like on the ropes. And now he delivered them wrapped up like a Christmas present. This issue, everything is going to be blamed now on Trump. Like everything was great until Trump wrecked it. He was just the pin that pricked the bubble. The problem was the bubble, not the pin. But he's going to get the blame. Republicans,
Well, the bubble was caused by this global trade regime that President Trump is pushing back.
All right, but Spencer, let's address this specific issue, because I think what Peter is saying is we're going to go through a serious, let's just call it a GFC, and let's do a cost-benefit analysis. You're talking about benefits, but are the costs worth it? That's number one. And number two, it sounds great what you're saying on paper, but in practice, it's not going to happen because the American general public, once we go into a recession, if not something worse, then they're going to wave the white flag and say no more of these tariffs, because that's what they're going to see as the initial problem. And we're going to go right back to where we were today, but we're going to go back to where we are today with an economic depression.
No, just to be clear, I don't make economic predictions. And the reason I don't make economic predictions is because you can't predict the economy. The economy is a complex system. It's an organic system. The best way to know what's going to happen in the future is to not treat it like you can't predict what's going to happen, but you can sort of forecast likely outcomes in the same way that you would forecast the weather or forecast the likelihood of an earthquake. Right? That's the difference between complex and simple systems. So I'm not going to make any economic predictions. What I will say is that based on historical precedent, I do not think that what my friend is saying is likely.
What historical precedent? This has never been done.
There have been plenty of times where countries have used tariffs to reshore their industries and to accumulate capital. And the best historical example is America itself.
Yeah, but okay,
we did this for 150 years.
Okay, so we eliminate all the goods that were coming into this country from abroad, like all the goods from China, that none of them come in, right? Where are the factories going to come from to produce this stuff? And how long is it going to take to build them? And where's the money going to come from to pay for it?
Well, simple answer. We're going to build them. We're going to build them by buying the goods in America. I mean, here's the deal. It's not like
we're talking goods in America.
You can buy the goods in America. So here's the deal. America's industry has been hollowed out, but that doesn't mean that every single producer of a good has been hollowed out in a particular industry. Like America, for example, still makes gloves and forks, but we make high-end gloves and forks. So,
but what if I don't want a high-end glove? What if I just want to keep my hands warm?
When the tariffs are in place, these high-end manufacturers are just going to come out with discount models. I mean, it's kind of like
do it now then.
It's kind of like, because they can't, because they're being undercut by product being dumped in from China.
Peter, let's let him finish.
They can't do it now because the products are being dumped in from China at below market rates. If we had fair competition between American factories and Chinese factories, Americans win hands down 10 out of 10 times because the American workers are more productive than the Chinese workers.
No, they're not.
They are literally more productive. No, America's factories are the most productive in the world.
They're not. Well,
no, because price bakes in productivity, but it also bakes in other externalized costs. Right?
Oh yeah, but
the Chinese products, Chinese products appear cheaper because of externalities, right? And we pay for those in other ways with social costs and with environmental costs and costs to our health.
Okay, so guys, I don't want to talk over one another here.
I mean, a libertarian paradise, everybody has cancer and they're dying from poisons in the environment. Nobody wants that.
Okay, let's not talk over one another here. So let's go ahead and Peter, why don't you go ahead and do kind of a final summary of your position, and then we'll go ahead and give the final say. Actually, I think Spencer, you started, so let's do that. Let's go ahead and give you the final, or you can state your final position here. Take maybe 5 minutes or so, and then we'll let Peter go ahead and have the final say since you started.
Yeah, I mean, in the conclusion, the comments that I'd like to conclude with are fairly simple. Over the last 50 years, America's industry has been absolutely hollowed out by the offshoring vicious cycle. America's producers have relocated to foreign countries, even though they're more efficient than the production in those foreign countries. And the reason that's been happening is because there's asymmetries between foreign markets and American markets. The size of this offshoring, the size of this sort of displaced production is quantified in the trade deficit. The trade deficit last year was $1.2 trillion. The running trade deficit since 1974, it's $25 trillion. How did we pay for it? Well, we sold assets like houses and farms and ownership of American companies, which gave the Chinese access to our technology industry. You know, the Chinese, they buy up our companies and then they steal the technology, and they stole $600 billion in technology on average per year. Okay, and they're doing that because they own our companies. It's not even stealing because they bought them. So and then we sell debts, right? So America is now a debtor nation. We owe $150 billion in interest every year to these foreign lenders for the privilege. Peter says we have the privilege of buying their goods. Yeah, we got the privilege of paying the debts too. So this offshoring, it displaces U.S. production, and it causes unemployment. If you look at unemployment rate between 1950 and 73, the average unemployment rate was 4.7%. Between 1974 and 2019, it's way higher at 6.32%. And it's actually higher than that because 10 million people have left the labor force. The actual unemployment rate is like 9 or 10%. So the reason for that is because we've displaced our production abroad. We'd have full employment if all those factories were here. And this has lowered wages. When somebody gets fired from a factory, they go get a job. If they're lucky enough to get a job, they get a job in the service industry. They take a 17.5% pay cut. That's why median wages haven't changed since 1973. You think there's been economic progress? We've gone back in time. And I'll tell you why. Because the median American household spends as much on its food, shelter, clothing, the needs, as they did in the 1960s. We've actually time traveled back in time in terms of our economic welfare. This has resulted in all sorts of things. We're eating lower quality foods, housing costs have gone up. Tariffs are going to reverse all of this. And I say that because there's good historical precedent for this. America used to run a massive trade deficit with Great Britain during the colonial era. Massive. And part of the reason for the American Revolution is because America was locked into a mercantile trade paradigm where America exported low value, unrefined products like tobacco to England, and then England shipped us the manufactured goods. It's the exact same thing that China is doing today. And that impoverished America, and GDP per capita and the welfare of the American people really skyrocketed after the revolution. And part of that is because America was able to industrialize and invest in capital. Unfortunately, over the last 50 years, the opposite has been true. Capital is leaving the country, jobs are leaving, and the industry is being hollowed out. And that's caused a lot of economic damage. But again, it's not really about the economy. And I'm just going to say, I just want to reiterate what I said. America is not a shopping mall. America is not a hotel. America is not a market. America is a nation of people. And these people have elected this president, Donald Trump, to represent their interests over and above their financial interests. By instituting these tariffs, and on Liberation Day, what President Trump has done is he said, look, this is a statement to the world that this is not simply a market. America is going to industrialize again. We're going to have good paying jobs that are broad-based so that people can support families. And if you want to learn more about the offshoring vicious cycle and how the economy actually grows, which is something called the technology virtuous cycle, you can get my book, Reshore. It's available on Amazon right now. We're doing 25% off for Liberation Day specials. And then you can also follow me on Twitter. The handle is Real SP Morrison. Thanks a lot.
Okay, great. Thank you, Spencer. Peter, go ahead and. Oh yeah, we'll go ahead and do a commercial break right now, guys. We'll be back in 20 or 30 seconds.
We do an encore.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, guys, so we are back after that commercial break, and the guys over at Zero Hedge just told me that this is incredibly popular. So because it's so popular and you guys are enjoying this so much, we're going to go an extra, I don't know, maybe 10, 15, 20 minutes. So we'll go back to Peter with his quote unquote final statement. And then we'll kind of pick it apart and let Spencer have another rebuttal. Yeah. And as long as you guys are enjoying it, as long as Peter's loaded up on water there,
yeah. I'd love to take some questions from the listeners after Peter gets to do his statement.
Okay, so Liam, just if you know how to cue that up, I'm happy to go ahead and read those for Spencer and Peter. So Peter, go ahead, 5 minutes, buddy. Just give us a quick summary of the debate so far and your position.
Yeah, well, first of all, of course, the American colonies had a trade deficit with England. England was the richest country in the world. They had factories. I mean, we were just startup. We were nothing. We were some vagabonds in some new colonies. So we had trade deficits when we were poor and young. But when we became a rich country, we had trade surpluses for a long time because we were rich. And we didn't go from deficits to surpluses because we had protectionist tariffs. We went from deficits to surpluses because we were free people and we had capitalism. And that's what made us wealthy. It was all the benefits of free people that did that. But what Spencer is doing and other people are doing, they're looking at the symptoms. and I agree, the symptoms of what's happened to our industrial base, the massive trade deficits, going from a creditor nation to a debtor nation, these are all signs of a nation in decline. I have been criticizing this and pointing it out for 20 years, my whole professional career, more. In my book, uh, The Real Crash, America's Coming Bankruptcy, How to Save Yourself and Your Future. That book was a little premature, but the real crash is coming. But I laid out all the things that we need to do, and erecting protective tariffs is not one of the things. Because what people are doing is they're looking at all these symptoms and they're saying, oh, it must be because foreigners are cheating, and we solve the problems just with these tariffs. It'd be like looking at a skin cancer and saying, "Oh, I see that blemish, a skin cancer. Let me cover it up with a Band-Aid. Oh, yeah, that's gonna solve it because now I don't see the blemish anymore." But the blemish is a symptom of the skin cancer, right? It's gonna keep on spreading if you don't get rid of it. We have to get rid of the cancer in our country, which is the massive federal government and the Federal Reserve. That's what's doing it, and exploiting the dollar's role as the reserve currency. Yes, it was an advantage, but it became our downfall. We live by the reserve status of the dollar, and we're going to end up dying by it, because the dollar is going to lose that status, because the world is going to take it away, because we have abused it to the point that we have so much debt that people are going to say, America can't pay its bills. There's no way we can repay this debt with money that has any real purchasing power. It's going to be massive inflation, and that's going to be the end of it. But we might have accelerated the process by pricking our own bubble with the tariffs. I've always wanted to have the crisis rather than keep kicking the can down the road and have a worse crisis later, but not on these terms. We have to have it on the right terms so the public is prepared, for it. Like when Milei, came into Argentina, and he prepared the country for what they needed, and the country was willing to take a chance on free market capitalism, on a libertarian, because they had enough pain from the socialists. Well, Americans haven't really had enough pain yet, because we haven't really felt it, because we've been insulated by the reserve status of the dollar and our ability to keep going deeper and deeper into debt with all this cheap credit, and use it to pay our bills and keep our economic necks above water. But fortunately or unfortunately, real pain is coming. But Americans aren't going to know who to blame, and I'm afraid that they're going to blame the Republicans and Trump, and they're going to look for more government, which is the last thing we need. We need a lot less government, and that includes not having tariffs, because what the tariffs are going to do to American industry is make it even less competitive than it is now, not just domestically, but internationally. Because unless we can get a rebate of all these tariffs when we export something, we're going to be making all of our own products less competitive abroad. And ironically, if other countries retaliate, the only way American companies who are now producing in the US are going to be able to sell their goods outside the US is if they move their production outside the US to escape the tariffs that are going to be aimed at us as countermeasures to the ones that we aimed at them. Because remember, all these tariffs that Trump claims everybody has are a fiction. Like, you could look at a country like Israel, right, where 98% of all the goods that we send to Israel go in tariff-free, zero tariffs. There's only about 2% of the goods that have any tariff, and it's mostly agriculture. And we do the same thing. It's bad, but we protect our peanut farmers, our sugar farmers, just like Japan protects their rice farmers. They're a powerful voting bloc, and so we protect them at the expense of the broader population. That's where most of the tariffs are. We have these tariffs on pickup trucks. They're pretty high. Why do we do that? Why do you think, we want to keep out the competition? So nobody has clean hands. Everybody has some special interest that has paid them off. And so there's some protective tariff. But
Okay.
every country that does it is worse off. When you have these people say, well, if tariffs are so bad, why do so many countries have tariffs? Because they're politically popular with certain people. I mean, why do so many countries have minimum wage laws? I mean, it's one of the stupidest laws you could possibly have, yet most countries have a minimum wage. Why? Well, because it's politically popular. Somebody benefits from it. And so we have them. So a lot of governments do stupid things. And one of
tell that to China that was able to industrialize in the space of 20 years based on tariffs and
I don't know
preying
that
on the
we
American
can.
market.
I don't know that we
Do
can
we have
attribute
any
that
questions?
entirely to tariffs.
Spite of tariff. Any country that succeeds in tariffs has succeeded despite the tariffs. Look, I'm fine.
That's certainly not the case.
Yeah,
Historically, that's certainly not the case. And you guys are just going to have to read the book and learn about economic history. I'm not a monetary policy guy. I'm a production-based guy.
Spencer, yeah, Peter, you went there for 5 minutes. Let's go back to Spencer here. I think one of the things that Peter was getting at is a trade war. So, we've got this, what now, 104, or we're thinking about 104% tariff on China. What happens if we just keep going higher and higher and higher? Is that something that you would suggest, or do we get to a point where you're like, okay, we got to time out, negotiate here, because this is going to end very, very badly?
I think the reality is that the tariffs are a political tool that are going to bring other countries to the table to renegotiate their corrupt trade policies. I think President Trump can use the tariffs, frankly, as leverage to probably lower the tariff rates from other countries and get American production access to foreign markets. And I think that would be a really big win for American manufacturers. I mean, imagine if India comes back and they said, okay, look, we want access to the American market, and tariffs are the price we pay to get into the American market. We're going to match you, and we're going to give you the same access to India's market that we have to America's market. That's going to open up, $15 trillion worth of consumer spending and 1.4 billion potential customers. I think the tariffs are being used by President Trump to make deals to get America access to markets that we currently don't have. And I think there's going to be a lot of money to be made in exporting.
Okay, so Spencer, is it your position that, and we might have some agreement here, you and Peter, is it your position that if these are a negotiating tool, that ideally we would just get all the tariffs for both countries down to zero?
No, then certainly not.
Actually would have free trade, or am I not understanding you correctly?
No, certainly not. And the reason for that is because there's never going to be a situation where you can have free trade. Free trade is a myth. It's a unicorn. It doesn't actually exist. And the reason for that is because the markets are different. Different countries have different regulatory systems. They have different laws. They have different people, different languages. You can't have free trade. It's always going to be asymmetrical. It's always going to be asymmetrical.
In your view, should the United States always have higher tariffs than the countries we're trading with?
Yes, and the reason for that is because America has the high ground. Tariffs are like a dam. Water wants to go to where the price is lowest, right? You have water at the top of a hill, it's going to pour down and puddle in the nooks and crannies. And we don't want that. We want to keep the water, we want to keep the wealth in America rather than pooling down to China, because all that does is it reduces America's wages and Americans' purchasing power down to the lowest common denominator. Americans don't want to live like the Chinese. And the only way to do that is to erect high tariff walls to keep the wealth in the country.
Okay, so if we have higher tariffs than everyone else, and then they lift their tariffs to match our tariffs, in your view, should we then increase our tariffs, just kind of one up them?
Well, we're going to have to wait and see how it pans out, right? This is an organic system. This is not a one-to-one, I know if I press this button, the machine does this. That's not the way the economy works. There's going to be some trial and error. And what we're doing is we're doing inductive reasoning from historical precedent and making sure that we follow up on this on an ongoing basis. But if you want to know ideally what I'd like to see and what I would recommend the president do, America should be putting on high tariffs, and the tariffs should be even higher on advanced manufacturing products, and we should try to have as much industry encompassed within America as possible. And then we can make exception tariffs for raw materials. The goal really is to become, like Great Britain at its richest, or China now, where we're importing raw materials or exotic products that we can't make here, like coffee beans or raw iron, and then refining that, getting all of that value-added production in the country and then selling the products abroad. We want to be at the top of the value chain, not the bottom of the value
But
chain.
wouldn't we be tariffing the input costs? The raw material, are you in favor of tariffing the raw materials, or
No, I
making a
said
carve-out
ideally,
for it?
I'm not in favor of tariffing raw materials.
Okay,
This-
I just wanted to be clear.
Right?
Let me make
Because
a
we
couple
don't
of
grow
points here.
coffee in America. It doesn't make sense to tariff coffee.
Okay.
But we can manufacture aircraft here, and we want to manufacture aircraft here. So let's build them here rather than in China.
Okay, got it. Peter,
It's
go
common
ahead.
sense.
Yeah. Well, first of all, unfortunately, most of our exports now are raw materials. We export food, we export energy,
Yeah, thank
scrap,
free trade for that.
and we import finished goods. Like we're like we export all the stuff that we grow and pull out of the ground. But if every country in the world dropped all of their tariffs today, our trade deficits are not going away. It does, because it's tariffs are not the problem. The tariffs are already relatively low. I mean, yes, we don't have pure free trade. The closer we are, the better. And we're closer now than the world has generally been until now. And so the closer you get to free trade, the better off everybody is going to be. The best thing that you could do as a country, regardless of what other countries do, is to have no tariffs yourself. I don't care if other people want to tariff their own citizens. Two wrongs don't make a right. I'm not going to punish my citizens because some other country wants to punish theirs. But, it was, I think it was Thailand, came to the U.S., came to Trump and said, okay, we'll drop all of our tariffs. And Trump said, oh, I don't care. It doesn't matter. So they're going to go
to Navarro. Yeah.
But no, we're not going to do it because, well, you got something else. What they're trying to claim, and this is one of the most ridiculous things, and it shows you how disingenuous it is. So they're guys like Howard Lutnick and Peter Navarro claim that the value added tax is like a tariff and that it's unfair that Europe has a VAT system that applies to our products, which is ridiculous because it applies to all products equally, including all the products that are made in Europe. It's a sales tax. So when we import a Mercedes from Germany, and if you buy that Mercedes in New York puts a sales tax on it. The federal government doesn't, but the state of New York does. New York pays the same sales tax. The Mercedes pays the same tax as Ford. Everybody is treated the same. The same thing with the VAT. That is not a non-tariff barrier. That's a consumption tax that they choose to put on all of their products. And it doesn't give their domestic companies an advantage. If they removed the VATs from ours and left them, then we would have an advantage. It'd be like, what if Mercedes said, hey, you got to take the sales tax off our cars? That's not fair. You can't charge a sales tax on our cars. Then only the imports would be tax-free. But if you wanted to buy an American car, you'd pay a sales tax. Look, it is ridiculous. The problems are internal. We are the reason that we have these huge trade deficits. We are the reason that we're selling off our assets. We are the reason that we've hollowed out our industrial base. It's us. We have to self-reflect on what we've done wrong and then fix the problems, not blame them on the rest of the world and just compound our problems with these tariffs. But,
Okay, Peter.
Yeah.
Let's just go. Let's summarize. Let's get back to Spencer here. Spencer, I think one of the points Peter brings up is something that I've tried to think through, and it's something I kind of struggle with how these tariffs are being presented and how they're being, the methodology, let's say. So it seems like the methodology doesn't just revolve around a deficit, and it doesn't necessarily just revolve around another country's tariffs that they have on our goods, but it's quote unquote cheating. And the problem I have with that is there's just no way to quantify this. It's unquantifiable. So do you agree with that? If so, how do you respond to that? That this is just something that is completely abstract. And in my view, it would be better if we do have the tariffs to actually have something that is quantifiable so we could know when we're making progress.
Well, I mean, the point is that, okay, so my understanding is that the Liberation Day tariffs are designed to reduce the trade deficit, right? And they're based on a ratio, I don't know exactly what the ratio is, but the overall point of them is to reduce the trade deficit, right? And that is, I think that's what they're going to do. right?
Yeah, but
Because
just Navarro came out, and I think it was Vietnam, maybe Peter, or Thailand,
Yeah,
and
one of those countries. Yeah,
because I think they
maybe
came to the negotiating table and said, okay, well, we'll consider taking everything down to zero. And the reporter asked Navarro if he would be okay with that, and he said no, that still doesn't do it because of all, I think he called it their non-tariff cheating, quote unquote. So would you have an issue with that? Would if they're if our tariff is 10% and theirs is 0, and then we're reducing the deficit, so we just let the cheating be for a while?
well, no, certainly not. Cheaters never prosper. I think it's important to note, and this I was making this point earlier. There are market asymmetries between America and every other country on earth. It doesn't matter how well integrated it is with us. There's market asymmetries between France and Germany. They're different countries with different populations, and those market asymmetries, are difficult to quantify, but they always exist. And those market asymmetries, can be summed up in general as America having the high ground, and these other developing countries having the low ground. And wealth being like water, it wants to flow downhill. So America needs those tariffs no matter what, because even if a country like, let's say China, for example, got rid of all of their tariffs. China says there's no tariffs on American goods. Okay, great. Sounds great. But it's not. It doesn't actually do anything, because the regulations in China are Byzantine and incomprehensible, and they're designed to keep foreign goods out of the markets. There's all sorts of other corruption, preferential land use policies. You got to cut a Chinese company in. A lot of people don't know this, but if you want to invest in China, you have to cut a Chinese partner in, and in doing so, that means you have to train the Chinese workers to manufacture the product. You have to give them all of your technology, and basically what China is doing is it's using foreign direct investment to train up Chinese companies, and then they just because they don't enforce American property rights, they just make knockoff brands and then start selling those. I mean, that's exactly how what is it, Huawei? This is how they got big. They're one of the biggest smartphone manufacturers. They basically just stole all of the American technology, set up their own copycat brands, and they're doing it for cheaper because they're subsidized by the government. And they're using those, they're outcompeting American brands on a global market.
Okay, so
because they're dumping their products at below cost. And then when the Americans are out of the markets, they jack up the price.
Okay, so Spencer, how do you quantify the asymmetry to know when things are becoming more symmetrical and the trade policies that we are implementing are working? Is it just strictly with the deficit that we have with that other country?
Well, to some degree, it's going to be trial and error, because, like I said, you cannot predict on a one-to-one basis inputs and outputs on a complex system, right? So we need to do trial and error, and maybe these tariff rates are going to be adjusted, and maybe on some countries they're too high, and maybe on other countries they're too low. But we're going to know that based on how the deficit fluctuates, right? If the tariffs, so I think what President Trump wants to do is he wants to get to a balanced trade or a trade surplus, so he can deflate this consumption bubble over time.
Okay, Peter, and I'm sure you totally agree with us having a trade surplus. So what's wrong with what Spencer's saying?
I've been one of the few people, in the investment community that has been critical of our trade deficits. It's been one of the things that I'm constantly pointing out. I remember when I was younger in my career, I'm 62, but I remember when I was starting out in the 80s, the trade deficit was like the most important number that would come out every month. No one really cared about the jobs report back then. It was the trade deficit. And if we had a bigger trade deficit, the dollar would go down like 300 points against the Swiss franc or the Japanese yen. I mean, people were waiting on pins and needles. I used to get to the office early in the morning because I was in California, because the trade deficit was that important. But now no one cares. And they're so much bigger now than they were back then. So I care about it. And, this whole idea about cheating. If a country wants to cheat, which means they're somehow dumping, right? They're selling us their stuff below cost. They're cheating. They only cheat themselves. We win. If somebody is dumb enough to sell us stuff at a loss, we'll take it all we can, and we'll do something else. We'll take the free money and we'll invest our resources someplace else. We win. They lose. But I want to kind of switch the subject a little bit, because this is.
Do you mind if I reply to that, though? You
let me
made
just
a
make this
point that I
point.
think I need to reply to.
Okay,
All right,
so
go ahead.
okay, go ahead, and then Peter, we can switch topics up a little bit.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Spencer.
Yeah, so just one point I'd like to make in relation to the dumping. Look, this is not there's no such thing as a free lunch. This is the difference between an economist and a businessman. And I said at the start of the program, I'm not an economist. I'm a businessman. I'm a lawyer. I run my own law firm. I've been in business here for 7 years. What the Chinese are doing is they're approaching this as an investment. They're saying, look, we're going to sell the products at below market cost, and we're going to float that for 10 years. We'll float it for 20 years. We don't care, because we have unlimited access to credit. But we're going to do it for long enough that we're going to kill off all of our competition, because in order to manufacture cell phones, it's very, very expensive to get into that market. There's high capital input costs, right? So if China is able to undercut the markets for long enough that they kill the foreign competition, the American competition, then they can swoop in and they can sell their products at an above market monopolistic rate, with the knowledge that new producers are not going to be able to get into the market because the barriers to entry are too high, they're too expensive. And even if a new company came on the block, they can just cut their prices to kill them when they're shooting up. So this is how monopolies work. And what China is doing is it's getting a monopoly on all sorts of manufactured goods. And they're doing that through unfair competition. They're playing a game that's panning out on a 10, 20, 50-year time horizon. We're not even in that game because we're worried about quarterly profits. So the Chinese are approaching this from the perspective of businessmen, and America's government is looking at this like an economist, and they're not thinking about time horizons.
Let's for a minute, let's agree to disagree on that. And I want to focus on something that is extremely important on this issue that Zero Hedge audience is going to care about. So earlier today, the Dow lost like 2,000 points intraday, one of the biggest reversals. It had a 4% gain and it closed negative a few hundred points. The Dow is down another 550 points as we're speaking, and that's the best performing index. The small caps, Russell 2000, are down another 2%. So it's now down 32%. This is a major bear market in the Russell 2000. That is the index that's the most sensitive to the domestic economy, right? You would think, oh, why are these small cap companies being decimated, right? Because of the magnitude of this recession that is being unleashed by these tariffs. But, a lot of people were saying, well, Trump's got a secret plan. He's crashing the stock market because that's going to bring interest rates down. People are going to buy bonds, right, when the stock market crashes. Well, now the bond market is crashing. Well, I'm looking at the bond market tonight. First of all, bonds got decimated today, and they're being decimated again tonight. So the yield now on a 10-year treasury is at 4.36. We're almost at 4.9 on a 30-year. I mean, 4.86 right now. But we're going to take out 5 maybe this week. Bonds are crashing. So now it's not just stocks that are crashing, it's the bond market. So people who thought, well, at least the silver lining in this cloud is we're going to get lower interest rates. We're getting higher interest rates. But now look at the dollar. Okay, here's what everybody was saying a few months ago. Trump is going to put on tariffs, but you know what's going to take the sting out of the tariffs? We're going to have a strong dollar, right? The dollar is going to go up. And so we're going to be able to buy products cheaper. And so foreigners are going to eat the tariffs because of their currency. Well, the euro is now at 110. The euro is rising. The dollar is getting creamed against the yen again. The yen is now about to break through 145. It was just at 160. Granted, the yen was very low, but the dollar is tanking against the Swiss franc. It's tanking against the euro. It's going down against the Japanese yen. So the dollar's going down. Bonds are getting killed. Stocks are getting killed. Gold is $3,000 an ounce, heading to who knows where. So the point is this: we're having a massive financial collapse that's going to reverberate throughout the banking system. We're going to have this huge recession. I mean, we've never had. The only time the Russell 2000 has been down this much since its existed was in recession. It was the 2001 recession where the dot-com bubble popped. It happened in 2008 with the global financial crisis, and then it happened during COVID, right? This doesn't happen. Markets don't collapse like this outside of a recession. You can argue, does the stock market crash cause the recession, or does the recession cause the markets to anticipate it and go down? But so
Well,
we're going to go
so
through after
the
recession.
markets
My point.
are not
So
the
I'm
barometer
almost
for
done.
America. They're
I'm
not the
almost
be all and end all for America's economy, right?
no, I'm almost done.
All
So
right, finish
we're
up, then I'm going to comment.
so we're having a major stock market collapse. I mean, the market can go down 50%. I mean, there's no reason for it to stop falling, especially with higher interest rates, which are going to push mortgage rates up, which are going to, and a recession means much bigger deficits, budget deficits. So we have to borrow. So my point is, if the announcement of these tariffs, right, instead of Liberation Day, Americans get liberated from all their financial wealth on paper. If a lot of Americans get liberated from their jobs, because you're talking about the factory worker. What about all the people that work in retail or in services or in other factories that depend on imported components? We're going to have mass layoffs. So if unemployment goes from 4% to 10% and prices are rising in the double digits, right? More than we saw under Biden. So we have double-digit price increases. We have double-digit unemployment, a stock market collapse, higher interest rates. How is Trump going to be able to say, don't worry, this is all according to my plan. Everything is perfect. We just got to stay the course and we're going to win. How is that possibly going to happen?
Well,
So-
first of all, the markets
ahead.
are not a barometer of the economic health of America. They're a barometer of the economic health of the financial elites' interests,
We're a
because they're the
financial
ones that
economy.
own the stocks, right? So what President Trump is doing with tariffs is he's realigning America's economy from a financialized economy, from a consumption-based economy, to a production-based economy. He's
But he's not
prioritizing
realigning it. He's not
production
doing
of
that.
wealth.
Peter,
That's exactly what he's
Peter,
doing.
let him make his point, please.
That's exactly what President Trump is doing. The entire point of the tariffs is to reshore America's industries, right? And reshoring the industries is going to create lots and lots of manufacturing jobs, and all of the jobs that are predicated upon those manufacturing jobs. I mean, we have to remember, factories are an anchor industry, sort of like a farm or a mine. Wealth flows around them. They bring wealth into a community because they're producing something of value, something that is exported, right? And they support all sorts of service jobs. So President Trump is instituting tariffs. Tariffs are now the price to access America's market. And of course, these foreign producers, they want access to America's market because America is the biggest consumer economy in the world. There's no company that doesn't want to sell their goods in America. So what they're going to do is they're going to invest in America. They're going to build factories in America so that they have access to America's consumer market. And we're both going to make money. But but Americans are, instead of having, paying for people in China or Mexico to get those jobs are going to be brought back to America. And this is going to, help even out the distribution of wealth, because right now, this is just one great funnel to take money from Main Street and put it into Wall Street. It's basically money laundering, right? Because you get all these money on these goods, it goes abroad, and then this money funnels back into the country through the balance of payments into asset prices, right? So so all of this trade deficit, it gets poured directly into the stock market. And who's benefiting from that? Well, the people on Wall Street, but not the regular people. The regular people lost their jobs. They're unemployed. So what President Trump is doing is he's shifting the economy from consumption to production, and he's trying to make this nation into a nation of makers rather than takers.
Okay, so Spencer, basically the end justifies the means, but I think Peter's position is, if we go through this recession, which we likely will, according to Peter, is the American public going to be willing to stand by Donald Trump and say, continue causing economic pain? Or are they going to wave the white flag? Because unfortunately, we might not have the economy we want, but we've got to play the cards that we have. And, this is just, we're left with this economy that none of us really like, but it is what it is. And I guess the main question there, is the American public going to have the stomach to go through with this economic pain to get to the other side?
Well, Peter acknowledges that we're in a huge bubble right now. And the question is, do we deflate it slowly over time by reducing the trade deficit? or do we just kick the can down the road 10 or 20 more years until it pops and really, really destroys the economy, right? Right now, America is at a point where we still have latent manufacturing production to scale up and to actually build the products that we need to do to pay off this debt. That might not be the case in 10 or 20 years. So President Trump is taking the hard action now to get this done so it's not as bad in the future.
Yeah,
and the question as to whether or not the people are going to stay with the president, well, time remains to be seen, but I think the people love President Trump. The people voted on his tariff platform, and I think the people are going to see it through.
Okay.
Yeah, let me look. Here's the thing. Look, even if I accept the fact that foreigners are going to decide to build their factories here, which they will not do, right? Nobody is going to come and build a factory in America.
Well, they're already doing it.
Oh, let me finish.
And trillions of investment pledged.
No, that's a fantasy. That people are.
Well, tell that to the people who are building the
companies.
Factories.
They manufacture products and they sell them worldwide. They are not going to build an unproductive factory in America because we erect tariffs. They're gonna write off most of the U.S. market, right? They'll still sell some goods in America at much higher prices, but a lot of the stuff that they used to sell to Americans, they're going to sell to somebody else. But the point I want to make is, even if
that's not what happens in China. China has its own domestic production for their domestic consumption, because people want to manufacture in China. And they want to do it here too.
Let me make the point, okay? Even if I concede that foreigners are going to, as a result of these tariffs, they're going to build factories in America. They're going to build supply chains. They're going to do all that. That's going to take many, many years, right? And of course, they have to be convinced that the tariffs are permanent, right? Because otherwise we can pull the rug out from under them, right? They spend all this money building these factories, and then another president comes in and takes out the tariffs, and they just lost all their money. But assuming they believe the tariffs are here forever, and they decide they're going to make these investments, then yes, maybe 3, 5, 10 years down the line, the economy that Donald Trump wants could be here. My point is, in the here and now, what's going to happen in 2025, long before they can break ground on their first factory? We have a financial crisis. We have a stock market crash. We have a great recession. All of this is worse than anything we had in 2008, which, by the way, I warned about that for years, and nobody listened to me, and I laid it out exactly the way it would happen. What we're about to happen, if we don't get rid of these tariffs, will be so much worse. It'll make that look like a Sunday school picnic. And while we bailed everybody out, right, during the 2008 financial crisis, we had bailouts. What Trump is going to have to do is say, no bailouts. We can't bail anybody out. We got to let everything collapse. No, if a bank fails, we have to let it fail. The Fed can't go in there, because if the Fed steps up and does QE, which unfortunately Trump is wants that, if the way we respond to this collapse is the Fed cranks up the presses and takes its balance sheet up to 20 trillion, 30 trillion, we will destroy the dollar completely. We will wipe it out. And then it won't even matter. Nobody will want access to our market, because we'll be a bunch of peasants, because the dollar won't have any value. And so no one's going to give a damn that we have a bunch of worthless dollars.
Okay,
yeah,
so
you're saying this is going to happen. Go ahead.
Go quickly, Spencer, then I'm going to summarize here, and I think we can go ahead and conclude. Okay, so do we want to do that commercial right now? Then we'll get back to Spencer. Okay, guys, we'll go ahead and take a 20-second break, and we will be right back with Spencer and a couple audience questions. Okay, guys, we are back from the commercial, so let's go over to Spencer. 30 seconds there, Spencer, and then we're going to go to an audience question.
Well, I was just going to say before the break that there's going to be some short-term pain anytime a major policy shift occurs. There's some economic dislocation. I mean, the president could cut income tax, and the media would complain that all of the accountants are going to be out of work, right?
I wouldn't.
Maybe not you, but a lot of people would. But there's always going to be, it doesn't matter how good the policy is, there's always going to be economic dislocation. The question is whether or not the American people have the stomach for the pain to get the gain. But like I said, the economy is an organic system. It's kind of like the human body in some ways. It's like the climate. And if you want to build up a muscle, you got to damage it a bit, right? You got to move it, you got to use it. And that's what President Trump's tariffs are going to do, right? It's a shakeup in the system, and America is going to build back more resiliently and stronger, sort of like a muscle. So it remains to be seen. Like I said, I don't make predictions, but I'm very, very optimistic based on economic history that President Trump is doing all the right things.
Okay, let's go over to this question, and I believe it's for both individuals. Let me read it here. So this is from PUC and at Zero Hedge. I live in Michigan in blame part of offshoring on worker laziness in the 70s and 80s. Are Americans now ready to work? So I guess the main question there, Spencer, is, employers right now are having a hard time just finding someone that is willing to work any job. We've been seeing this for the last 4 or 5 years since COVID, and that's a job that's 35 hours a week where they can work half the time at home in their pajamas. So, what leads you to the conclusion that we're going to have all of these workers ready to jump up and start making underwear and work on an assembly line? I guess maybe that's what he's saying.
I mean, there's lots of people who collect garbage and do sewer work. People will do any job if it's paid an appropriate amount. And part of the problem right now is that people don't want to do these jobs for two reasons. I mean, first, the jobs are underpaid because you're competing with people in Mexico for the same job. So of course, the wages are going to be depressed. And then second of all, I think it's really important to remember that a lot of people are these so-called discouraged workers. Since I think 2000, since 2001, about 10 million people have left the labor force. Most of those people have left the labor force because they could not find work. They've just been chronically unemployed. There's whole towns that depended upon these factories that offshored, and these towns, when the factory died, so did the town. But guess what? The people can't just move because people aren't fungible items. I mean, people have to stay in these communities to take care of, they might have aging grandparents. They might, have kids that they want to grow up in the small town. I mean, they might have, they might love their community and want to stay, even though there's not great opportunities anymore, right? People are not interchangeable parts. So I think it's really important to remember that the whole point of what President Trump is doing is he's trying to bring back broad-based prosperity to local American communities that have been, left out of the financialized economy.
What do you do with robotics, Spencer? What if we bring back all these manufacturing jobs, and then in 3 years we've got robots doing everything?
Oh, robots are going to do tons of work, and you know what? Robots are doing most of the work in China right now as well. But unemployment, is so the employment in a given sector is a dance between productivity rates and output rates. And if the output of product is increasing at the same rate that productivity is increasing, you're not going to have any unemployment caused by, getting all of these robots in the door, right? I mean, you got to think about China, for example. China has invested in lots of capital and lots of robots to do the work, but their output has increased faster than those productivity has increased, and as a result, there's more people being, millions and millions of people are employed in manufacturing in China. The same thing could be true in America, even if we have the robots, but we have to have the output first.
Okay, Peter, what do you think about the American worker? Are we at the point where they're just too lazy and this manufacturing hope is kind of a pipe dream?
Well, ironically, maybe some of the workers most likely to take these jobs are the ones we're kicking out of the country. The immigrants who, a lot of them are hardworking. They're not all criminals. But yeah, I think we're going to
American
have a
people are
lot.
hardworking. They're going to rise to the occasion and take
No,
these jobs.
look, I think you overestimate a lot of the American public. They've been coddled for a long time. There's a lot of Americans that think the country owes them something. They think they're entitled. And I think that what's probably going to happen with a lot of Americans, rather than taking jobs, they're going to take to the streets. I think we're going to see riots in this country, maybe before the end of the year, because the products are not going to be there, right? So even if you have your welfare, your food stamps, and you go to the store and the shelves are empty, right? What are you going to do? I mean, people riot when their team wins the Super Bowl or something. I mean, the lights go out and there's a riot. I mean, when we have a real economic crisis, when we have real shortages, which we're going to have, and who knows, the government, Trump is saying you better not raise your prices, right? Don't raise your prices. I wouldn't be surprised if we have price controls. He criticized, because Harris was talking about price controls. Well, Trump talked about them too. He wanted to cap interest rates that credit card companies could charge. But I could see the Trump administration trying to put price controls on all these companies that are passing on the tariffs. Because remember, Trump promised that taxes were external revenue, right? Hey, that's why the public voted for tariffs, because Trump said the Chinese are going to pay them. We're going to make the Mexicans pay them. We're going to make the Canadians pay them. Well, when Americans find out that they're paying them, either because they're buying the goods or the goods aren't even there because they can't even be imported because the importers know they don't have the money, right? That's when they're going to revolt. And it's not going to be orderly. I mean, we don't have the type of society we had during the Great Depression, where people really were rugged individuals. They had respect for other people's property. When they first introduced welfare during the recession, when Roosevelt introduced it, and they called it relief, a lot of people didn't even want to take it. They felt bad about taking money that they didn't earn. Nobody feels bad about that now. Everybody tries to cheat the government to get as much as they can, right? That's why Doge is finding all this fraud.
Society is already
Everybody wants to get what they can from the government. There's no sense of responsibility. No, everybody is fine stealing from somebody else as long as they do it through the government. Okay, so we don't have the type of Americans that we had back in the Depression. So it's going to be very different, because what we're going to go through if we keep these tariffs, we will go through an economic downturn. In order to rebuild our industrial base and get back to what you say you want, we're going to have to endure a depression, not just a recession, a depression with very high prices, not a depression where prices go down like during the 1930s.
That's a bold statement.
Where prices go way up.
We have historical precedent that prices are not going to increase, and in fact, prices are likely to decrease because we already have inflation.
How are they going to decrease?
We already have inflation baked into the system. We talked about this. It's a balance of payments. You're only looking at the price of goods. You're only looking at the price of goods, but when we get these goods from these foreign countries, the money comes back and it increases the costs of shelter. And that's why Americans today are spending more of their income than ever on needs, food, clothing, shelter, because the cost of rent and mortgages has gone up so high because of the so-called cheap goods.
I do agree with one thing. I think that rents will come down because 2 or 3 families are going to share the same house. So many people are going to be renting out rooms and taking in boarders. And so many kids are going to be moving in with their parents. And so many elderly parents are going to be moving in with their grown kids.
We're going to see millions of new jobs.
We could see rents coming down.
Manufacturing jobs.
Okay, guys. So
it's going to be a renaissance for America's manufacturing. It's
no, it's not.
Let me go ahead and summarize here. I think it's fair to say that Spencer sees the labor issue as a kind of a nothing burger, that Americans will rise to the occasion. Peter has a different view, that they've been coddled so long that it's unrealistic to believe that we're just going to flip a switch and the manufacturing is going to be here in a year or two, maybe in 5 years, 10 years, but that's a lot of economic pain. You guys disagree a little bit on the severity of what will happen if these tariffs are implemented. Where you guys completely agree is the problem. You completely agree the deficit is a problem. You completely agree that we've hollowed out our manufacturing base. You disagree on why, and then you just simply disagree on the solution. With Spencer, the solution is tariffs. With Peter, the solution is to reduce regulations, bureaucracy, red tape, go onto a gold standard, shrink the size of the government, and get rid of the Fed. And I would assume that Spencer would be on board with that policy as well. So did I summarize everything pretty well, guys?
Well, we don't even have to go to that.
Admirable attempt at a summary. It was pretty complicated.
Yeah, I would love to be back on a gold standard and get rid of the Fed. But,
I love the gold standard too, so we can agree on that.
But we need much higher interest rates. And so, what I would rather do to China, here's what I would rather do to China. Let's default on our treasuries because we're never going to pay. So if we want to get China, let's just default on our treasuries. But, I don't care if we default on a lot of these treasuries because I want to move to an immediate balanced budget. I don't care if nobody wants to lend us money because we shouldn't be borrowing money. The government should not be borrowing money. The
Okay,
government has the power to tax, and if it wants to spend money, it should raise it legitimately through taxation. There is no reason for the U.S. government to borrow any money. The problem is we borrowed so much.
I think Spencer would agree with that. So I think I put a beautiful bow on this whole entire debate. I will take credit for that conclusion. It's very difficult.
One more thing I gotta get in.
No, Peter, you're ruining my perfect conclusion.
Peter, you're done. You're done. We got a bow on it. Okay.
Yep. Peter, thanks.
I'd be happy to have a conversation with you again, though.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this was fantastic, Liam, and the guys over at Zero Hedge. Hopefully, if people enjoyed it, I think Peter, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he'd be willing to do it again. Spencer, fantastic arguments. It was great to meet you virtually, and I think you would probably be willing to do it again as well. And it was a load of fun. So I want to thank both of the participants, and I want to thank Zero Hedge.
Yeah. I just want to throw out, I'm going to do a spaces because I know people want to ask questions. So I decide I'll go on X and do a spaces. If anybody wants to ask questions about this debate, as soon as this thing is over, I'm just going to sign on.
You should let Spencer host it with you.
If he wants to join, I'll bring him up on stage. You know,
that'd be fun.
I'll join, but we'll do questions. No more debating,
George. On the spaces. And I was going to say the one bright cloud in this silver, the silver lining is that at least this thing is going to prick the Bitcoin bubble. And I think Bitcoin's going to crash.
No, it's going to take us down a whole nother rabbit hole. All right. On that bombshell, guys, enjoy the rest of your evening. And as I always say, make sure you're standing up for freedom, liberty, free market capitalism. And we'll see you on the next video. And we'll see you on the next debate.
Thanks all. God bless.